for coming to our seminar. We appreciate it. My name is Brad Janson. I've been making knives for about 7 years or so now. And I don't do it full time, I don't do it part time, I do it for fun, good time. And this is this is a lot of fun for me. So I really like the challenge of figuring problems out. And knife making is all about problem solving. And what we're trying to do here today is give a kind of an introduction. So if you wanted to start making knives, how would you get started? What are some of the common challenges, things to go through? And this can be a great hobby. I'm telling you, you can spend very little money to do it, or you can go absolutely wild and get every tool in the world. So some of the things that we put together here, at least the session I'm going to go through on attaching scales, is more geared towards you don't need every tool in the world to do it. You want something you kind of pick it up next week and do. So, guys, want to introduce?
I'm Thaddeus Steger from Hershey, Pennsylvania. I've been making knives for about 7 years also. I got hooked up with Brad on Trad Gang, and we started making bows on there together. And then just through the years, we kind of strayed away from bow making, started making knives and making tools to make knives, and then strictly making tools for a while. And yeah, it just kind of evolved into what we're going to talk about here today. We had no experience before that, just trying to pick up from guys like Jeff Springer online. Tippett, I know is very active here, but he really got Brad and I off on in the right direction of why he does certain things, and that's why we're here to talk to you guys.
All right, and so we have a lot of slides to go through. And, if you guys have questions, just let's make it informal. Go ahead.
Do we get chocolate?
Yes.
Yeah, it'll be mailed to you after. It's in quarantine right now for 2 weeks.
So here's what we plan to go through. So we're going to go through some of the, just the basic principles of knife making and heat treating. There's a lot of confusion around heat treating, so I try to put it together. It's such a deep topic to go through too. I'm trying to make it really simple so you don't understand. Thaddeus has some really good slides on how he forges a hunter. Really give you a sense of how to move the metal and the steps to take to just make a simple knife. And then I'm going to go through how to install scales on a finished blade blank. And that's a great way to start making knives. You can buy blade blanks from a number of different knife suppliers, and cheap. I mean, sometimes cheaper than you buy the steel. You buy a finished knife blank, heat treated, ground, maybe do some hand sanding on it and install scales in. It's a lot of fun to do that. It requires much more minimal tooling than forging and power hammers and all the kinds of cool stuff that you can actually get. And we're happy to go through Q&A as well. So I put the slide together, top 3 tips to success in knife making. The first is, marking accurately and trying to work to a line. And it's really important for a number of different things, but you're constantly marking lines and working to a line. And if you can do that well, you can do things very precisely. So the first thing I'll say is when you're marking the line, think about the line that you're marking, right? So aim small, miss small. So use a very fine marker. So I don't use a pen, I don't use a marker, I don't use a Sharpie. I use a carbide scriber, and that works real well. I use it both on handle materials, blades, and everything else. 2 is getting things flat. Knife making a lot of times is getting 2 surfaces to go together, grinding a flat blade. You have to figure out a way to get things flat. There's a number of different ways to get things flat, right? You can have surface grinders. They work great to get things flat, very precise. You can use files if you're good with a file. One of the things that I use in my shop all the time is a surface plate, a machinist surface plate. 8.5 by 11 or so. Keep it clean, put sandpaper right on top of it. You can put your scales on there, go back and forth and get the scales flat. You can use it for marking. I use it all the time. You can go to, you don't need like a precision A grade machinist surface plate either. You could go to Home Depot and get a marble tile, for example, right? for a couple bucks, and that would work fine. So those are really nice to have. I have those all over. I have several of them. I have all over my shop for different uses, and I use them all the time to get things flat. Another thing I would use to get things flat is a disc burner. Just a 9-inch disc, stick a sheet of sandpaper on there, and you can grind and sand things flat much shorter. And then third, this is probably the most important one, and you kind of learn this over time, but ordering your tasks. So every task that you go through knife making, really, in my mind, it's not all that complex, right? So, you know, flattening the scale, that's not hard. Shaping the scale is not that hard. You know, keying something together, that's not hard. But to get the good quality product at the end, you have to figure out how to order those tasks. So I'll give you an example. So if you had a hidden tang knife, right, with a guard on it, and you want to have a nice finish on that guard, in front of the guard, so you look at it, there's not scratches or anything. I mean, it'd be almost impossible to try to finish sand that guard after it's on the knife, you know? Because you'd be trying to get in there with sandpaper, and you're trying to, you know, sand this way across the blade, and you're always going to hit the blade. Now your blade's going to have a scratch on it. So you have to order your task. Before you put that guard on that knife, you put it on the surface plate. You know, simple as that. And it's nice, clean, and you install it, and we try to never touch it again. So when we go through that third session to put the scales on the knife, I took a picture, all the pictures along the way. And I'll show you the order that I take to put those on to get you a good product. So ordering tasks is really important. So I wanted to put together just a quick slide on heat treating. And as I mentioned, you know, heat treating is, I mean, it's a very deep, complex topic. And actually, when you go online, it's almost, you know, when you read stuff online, it's almost overly complex. So complex that people are just kind of shy away from it. It's just too much, right? Metallurgy and marticide, I mean, all these terms, right? So I thought if you knew these 4 terms and what they are and what you need to do to get this heat treatment, it'll really help you. So first is annealing. When you talk about a annealed blade or annealed steel, basically it means it's soft, it's ready to work, right? You anneal steel to reduce the hardness, the stress, and typically for like a carbon steel knife, like if you grew up with a pocket knife, it was probably like 1095. It's just a simple carbon steel. What you would do is you would get it hot to critical temperature and slowly cool it. Slow as in cooling it like, you know, less than 50, 100 degrees an hour. So as an example, if you had you know, a lawnmower blade, right? A hardened lawnmower blade. Think about putting that thing in your vise and trying to bend it. You want to be able to do it, right? If you would get a good bonfire going, throw that lawnmower blade in the fire and walk away. When you come back the next morning, that fire's still going to be hot to the touch, right? It's going to slowly cool. By the time you get that lawnmower blade out where you can touch it, you can put that thing in the vise and bend it right over. That would be annealed steel. Soft, easy to work, easy to grind, easy to drill. You know, it's not going to ruin your bits and stuff. So annealing is an important thing. Now, most of the knife steels that you buy are already annealed. So I rarely have to go through this process. You know, so you don't have to use it that much if you buy the right steel, or unless you're making a very complex blade or something where you have to anneal it in between processes. That's annealing. The next one is normalizing. So, you know, when you're forging a blade, or even grinding a blade, or doing anything to metal, it induces stress in the metal. Normalizing is like a stress relief. It really helps relieve the stress in the metal. How do you do normalizing? You get it to critical temperature, take it out of the forge, or wherever you're going to use to get to critical temperature, just let it air cool to black. You can do that if you start it hotter, normalize, a little less hot, normalize, a little less hot, normalize. That's good for the steel. It really refines the grain structure. So that's normalizing. Normalizing is simple. You would do it. I do it every time. You know, after I would forge a knife, the last thing I would do is just normalize it before I set it down.
What do you mean by critical temperature?
So critical temperature is, you know, so a simple carbon steel. What makes it a knife, what makes it hard, is it has carbon in it. And if you get that steel up to a critical temperature, it starts to move around the solution. that's around 1,500-ish, something like that. It's all dependent on the steel, but around there, right? For a basic knife steel.
So just before it burns the steel, I guess?
No. Yeah, way before that. I mean,
When it's no longer magnetized.
yeah.
It's easy.
That would be, yes, that's true.
That'd be an easy way to check it.
It's orange. The color is orange.
Okay.
So hardening, and this is what makes the knife, right? You can have a nice knife, but it's not hardened, and it's not heat treated correctly, it's not going to perform. So hardening is heating to above critical temperature, and usually quenching it and what? Cooling it. Cooling it so rapidly that that carbide stays in the mixture, and it hardens the blade. Now, when you harden that blade, it's also brittle, right? You could almost break it. And you can't break it. It's hard. It's hard. So we need the hardness of the blade, but you need to bring that hardening down to the right level, and that's called tempering, which is I find like the most misused term, tempering. But tempering is really just relieving the brittleness and the hardness of the knife. It's a slow ruining of the hardening that you just induced. So not making it, super hard and brittle, but hard enough to hold a good edge, or what you're ever going to use it for, the tool steel, and have enough toughness such that it doesn't crack and chip. So I created this diagram here to help you understand a little bit about tempering. So what do we have here on the Y column on that left side, right? Temperature, starting at 0 degrees to 1,400. Okay, and then the top is a Rockwell C hardness measure. This is a measure that the people use to measure how hard the steel is. So if I took a simple 1095 steel, I hardened it right out of the quench, that would be about 66 Rockwell. It's too hard. The knife would break, the edge would chip. It's too hard. I would temper it, slowly ruin that hardness by putting it in the oven at a certain degree. And as you walk down the chart, as you can see, the higher the temperature, the lower the Rockwell becomes, right? So, for example, around 375 or so, that would reduce that hardness down to 62 Rockwell. And to give you an idea, 62 Rockwell is about the hardness of a bandsaw tooth or a file or something like that. It's still pretty hard, right? If I would go maybe 400 degrees or so, that would give me a 61 Rockwell. And that's what I usually make my folding knives off. It's still fairly hard knife, hard edge. But folding knives, you're not chopping, you're slicing. It's usually slicing, so you can have a little bit of harder edge, and you don't need the toughness. Let's say you're making a larger Bowie knife, maybe you would shoot for 58 or 59, something like that. Something that's going to have a little bit more toughness, it's going to have a little bit more stress. And then to really hammer this point home, an axe, let's say an axe is around 55. I mean, axe has a lot of stress in it, right? So you would want a little bit more toughness, and you would sacrifice the edge holding capabilities by reducing the hardness. And then take it even further, like a railroad track. Railroad tracks are all kinds of hardness, but like around a curve or something, that's usually like 42 Rockwell. So they still needs to be hard, right? Because those trains are going on all day, so it needs to maintain its shape, and it has to be hard, but it has to be soft enough to take all the stress. And then take that to extreme sledgehammering on something you're just beating on. It can't be soft metal. So it's hardened, but it's around 30-ish, 35, 33, whatever you want to say. Somewhere around there for Rockwell. So the more stress, the more punishment you're going to put on the steel. Usually the lower the Rockwell, the higher the Rockwell, it's more for higher edge holding capabilities. There's also growth. That makes sense? Yeah.
Is there a general rule of thumb on how long you keep it at that temperature to achieve that hardness?
I usually temper 2 times, 2 hours a piece. And if you kind of look at this chart, what you can see is when you're making knives, you can do most of them in the kitchen oven, right? For a simple carbon steel, you're usually not going over 450 or something like that. But I have a heat treat oven that I have. I'll use that heat treat oven for quenching, for hardening the blade as well, because I want to get it exactly at 1500 or whatever it is I need to be. And then I'll set it later at 400 degrees or 425. And I'll keep a record of the knives that I make, or not really the knives I make, really the hardness that I get from different steels based on my equipment, I mean, that heat treat doesn't say it is 400 degrees, but, who knows what it is, 412, 430, I don't know what it is. So whatever that is giving me, I'll keep record of that so I can repeat and get a similar result. All right, Ed.
Okay. Before I start with that, I'd like to go over a couple things, talk to a couple people here earlier today, different types of methods in making knives other than forging, a couple things that I've learned throughout the years in doing this, and then we'll go into the steps of forging a full tang knife. And my first recommendation, if anybody's interested in this, is to see if there's a local class somewhere, a blacksmith shop, some kind of smithy. I know Renaissance fairs will let you in just to give you a little chance to do it a little bit before you put any money into a forge. Or I can send you drawings on forges. We can send you drawings on like railroad track anvils to get you started, but it would be really nice to go into somebody that's already set up right now. There's two methods in making knives. There's forging, which is heating and manipulating the steel to the shape that you want, and there's stock removal, which is just buying a section of steel, cutting out the shape that you want, and grinding it to shape. They're both apples for apples. You're going to get the same product. You're not going to get a better product out of a forged knife than you will a stock removal knife. It's going to be exactly the same. Years ago, they talked about edge packing, where you would hammer down on the edge of your knife and it would say that it packed the carbides or the carbons down onto the edge of the knife, and it would make it hold its edge longer. And through the years, laboratories, testing proved that wrong. So forging's fine, that's why I do it. And a couple of the other reasons that I do it is I like Damascus, and you need to learn how to forge if you're going to make Damascus. I like to make sanmai, which is a Japanese word for 3 layers, where I'll put stainless steel jacket over a high carbon steel center. And I really like the looks of that knife. But it was about 7 years ago that Jeff Springer was posting on Trad Gang, and he had these very simple looking knives, and he called them a brute de forge. And they had a hammered finger guard in them. And I messaged him, said, boy, how do you put that finger guard in that knife? How do you do that? And he said, well, I have to put it in my forge. I get it up to about 1700 degrees, and I hit it with a hammer maybe 8 times, and I put it back in the forge. And he said, I have to do that like 10 or 15 times in and out of the forge to get that finger guard in there. And he didn't make it sound difficult. He made it sound easy. He said, just take some time. And it was very motivating for me to listen to that, saying, I think I can do this. So that was one of the reasons that I stuck to forging. A couple of the things that I learned throughout the years is, I know we're in the forged and fire era that they're making knives out of, like Brad said, lawnmower blades. They're making old springs, whatever they can find laying around that they think has enough carbon in it. That's what they're making knives out of. Good quality steel is the cheapest part of the knife. I mean, if you go buy good scales for a knife, you're going to end up getting $80 into scales on a knife. You know, if you're looking for sheep or something like that, it'll even go up more than that. If you're looking for ivory, it'll be a couple $100 for scale. If you buy that piece of steel, it's gonna cost you about $8. You know, so I tell everybody, just buy good steel. If you wanna make a good knife, buy good steel. And back to that, there is quench oils that people use. I know a lot of people use canola oils. A lot of people will have used motor oils or transmission fluids, all terrible things to be quenching your knives into. They make laboratory grade oils for particular steel. So if you know what the steel is that you're using, you can buy the right quench oil that'll work for several steels, but that is something that,
And they last a long time.
yeah,
They
you'll
don't
never
go
burn
bad,
them up.
they don't smell.
And don't be in a hurry. That's definitely probably my biggest lesson in forging knives. If I have 20 minutes to go out to the garage and make a knife, I don't make a knife. You know, I'll make a flower, I'll make just something, but not a knife. Okay, and like it says here, steps in forging a knife. I'm not saying this is how you must do it. This is just the way that a guy taught me to do it. I went to the New England School of Metalwork for a class. My instructor was Nick Rossi. This is what he did. He recommended going through all the steps, forging all your steps, and hanging it on your wall to where you have a reference that if you don't forge a knife for 3 or 4 months, you can always go back and look at how you're supposed to do it. So step one, can everyone hear me all right? Yeah. Step one, I like to call it pulling back the corner. So what I do is I get that into the forge, that piece of steel, and I get my forge up to about 1900 degrees. This is probably the hottest I'll ever get this knife. But I don't like to call it hammering down the corners, because if you hammer down on the corners of a piece of hot steel, your corners will buckle like this, and they call it a fish mouth. So it'll roll over like this, and then you'll have a little cavity in there that a little cold shut. So I like to call it pull back the corners. That tells you need to heat it up. We're hitting it with the hammer, we're pulling everything back, because what we're trying to do is establish the point. And that's on this step. When I establish that point, I use a rounding hammer that I made, but you can see where I'm pounding down on that corner. I'm just trying to get that point established to where it's located and with absolutely no cold shuts in it. And then what we do is we drop that point down. We just fold that point right down to the anvil, and all this will start making sense here in a little bit. But this, I'm just trying to go over the steps and how I get there. So after that point's laid down flat, I'll establish the location of the finger guard and start drawing out that anvil. So I just lay that right over the edge of my anvil. I see exactly where I want it, and I know about how long I want to make my handle. So what I'll do is I'll locate that, I'll hit it real hard at that temperature, and what it'll do, like over on the left-hand picture, it'll just recess down over top the edge of the anvil, and then I can start pulling that thing out to where it fits my hand or whoever's hand I'm making that knife for. And then I'll locate the choil. And I put a little description of the choil on here. The choil is the unsharpened part of the blade that separates the cutting edge from the tang. Not all knives have choils on them. They don't have to have a choil, but I prefer to put one on mine because when I'm sharpening my knife, I want that knife to be sharp the whole way back through. And when I'm putting it on stone, it's a real good indicator for me to have a point to stop. You know, some people will just roll their choil back over, but I like to have that good and sharp right there. The next step, I lay that hot blade over top the corner of my anvil. and I start putting a curve in that. And I roll that tip over the end of my handle. And the reason that I do that is because when I start hammering down on those bevels and I start applying that pressure to flatten it out, in this area right here, when I start hammering down here, this blade wants to curve back up around. So if I start with this flat, that blade will just curve all the way up around. So I decide to let the steel work with me a little bit here. I move it down, I start hammering my bevels on both sides, and then that blade will finally curl up around, just the way I want it to. So I just have to manipulate it a little bit in that process. And then what I'll do is I'll get the steel to a dull red, and that's how I get my hammer marks out. Because when I'm sitting there, you know, I pull this thing out, I'll hit it with my hammer. I might be hitting it with my round side of my hammer or my flat side of my hammer. There'll be a bunch of marks in there, and it used to bother me when I first started making them, because I see a lot of these really high-end makers out there, and I don't see any hammer marks in their blades. Well, every time I make a blade, I have one little dimple for a hammer mark in there, and I can't figure out how to get them out. And then I went and watched a master smith one time, and by the time he was done, that thing had more hammer marks in it than I had ever seen, but he put it right back in to the heat. He brought it out in a dull red, he put a little water on his anvil, and he just tapped it and got all those marks out like he's done it for 100 years. You know, it was really nice to see. So that's what I started doing here.
So you use a smaller hammer then?
Yep, I'll use a smaller hammer, and I also have a thing called a flatter, which is a piece of steel that I'll lay on top of my knife, and then I'll hit my hammer down on top of that, and it'll kind of planish everything off. So the anvil side will take care of the bottom side, and then the flatter will take care of the top side, just to get all the marks out there. But yeah, you guys are more than welcome to pull these off. There's just a little magnetic stand, and you can take a look at all the steps here on them. And I think you're up, Brad. All right.
All right, so I have a bunch of slides here. This is how I would attach and shape and pin together scales to a knife blade. So first, I just want to talk about, you know, how do you get to this point right here? You can buy these blades, like I said, from Max Suppliers all the time. And I was on Knife and Gun Supply with the website the other day. They had these little paring knife blades, hardened, ground. They're $2.50 a piece. All right, I mean, I can't buy steel for that, right? So I mean, you can buy them cheap, and you can buy them all kinds of steels. If you want a stainless steel, they sell them in that. You can buy Damascus, you can buy everything. But this is just a simple one that I made. I had in my shop. Monty's in the room here. Let's see. The other Monty. Anyway, Monty sent me some of his scissor steel ones. It's stainless, so I made this out of it. But anyway, this is small, just a little hunter. It's, as you can see, it's hardened. I have the holes drilled for the pins. It's been ground, and it's basically sharp already, pretty close to sharp. What I'm doing here is I'm doing a final finish on that knife. And after I do that, I'm not going to go back and try to sand that knife anymore. So I'm ordering my tasks. So on the left there, I have a rubber wheel, an 8-inch wheel chucked up in a vise, and I have drawers with different grades of sandpaper in my shop. And I have all my sandpaper cut up into these little strips, 1 inch by 4 inch or whatever they come out to be. And so I'll use that, I'll put it on that wheel, and I'll run that knife across to get that final finish on it. I'll then go over to my surface plate, where I need to get things flat. So I'll put some sandpaper on that surface plate and rub that ricasso on there to get the final finish on that ricasso. And I'm done with the sanding of that knife for now, at least for the blade. Okay, so now we're going to go to the handling material. So in this instance, I'm using something called micarta. That's the black stuff. Micarta, think about it like it's almost like a bowling ball. It does have fabric or some type of binder in between. It could be paper, it could be linen, it could be canvas. But it's cheap stuff and it's like it's bulletproof. I mean, it's very durable. And I really like working with it. I will usually put a liner material underneath. So I bet that micarta there, that black stuff, is probably 3/16 maybe, or something like that. And that liner material is about 40 thousandths. So I'll use both. Gives it a little bit nicer look to it. And first thing I'll do is I'll see what I need, roughly. It doesn't have to be precise. So I put my blade on there, I draw it out, and see roughly how much I need. I'll flip the blade over, draw out my other side, and I'll block cut those out, right? Something very rough. That's what I'm gonna work with. After I do that, I will take 220 sandpaper and scuff up the surface. Get all the burrs off the edges, however I cut it, get it nice and clean, and then I'll clean it with acetone. And acetone is like the most used chemical in my shop, at least. And a good tip is put it in a dishwashing bottle. It's so much easier to have that little squeezed bottle rather than taking the cap off and doing that. So I buy that stuff in the gallons, and I have these bottles all over my shop. Clean it up with that. Now it's clean. It's ready for glue. So I will then glue that liner material to that micarta, and you can probably do that 100 different ways. You could probably the easiest way to do it, but I think I've never done it, but I'm sure it would work fine, is just using contact spray. Because you're going to pin this whole thing together anyway, right? So it's not going to go good. But what I usually use is this Loctite product. It's 324. It's an acrylic, 2-part adhesive. It's kind of like epoxy, but I don't think technically it's epoxy. And it has this activator. You spray one surface. Yeah, you got it. Makes a really nice handle material. I don't know about this.
How long does that take for send-off or stabilization?
Usually a few weeks or something like that.
I've seen people make those at home where it's like a little vacuum chamber in a jar and take a small block and pressure it.
I had a vacuum pump, and I was going to make one time, but the results I get is actually not that expensive. I mean, you go to some of the dealers that sell those blocks, like they pay 50 to 60 bucks a block, right? I mean, I think with Daddy's and I sent those things off, we didn't have more than a few dollars in each block.
Will they do any size, like for a bow riser?
I think they will.
I've heard of them. They will?
Yeah, you can send them an actual bow riser. And actually, that knife and gun is one of the only people that I would send that to, because they have the right equipment. If you have a larger piece of wood, they can make sure that they're getting that resin epoxy sucked into that. Because a lot of times people will use home brews like cactus juice and things like that, and they try and do it themselves, and they'll buy a vacuum pump. It's like a residential type vacuum pump, but it will not, it'll get the outer skirt of it, but it
not
won't
permeate.
It won't permeate all the way in. So it's real good for like pen makers, guys that are turning pens down. That cactus juice was like a miracle for them. But yeah, bow risers, definitely K&G, and they can get it pulled.
What about knife seams? So a lot of people ask, okay, if I want to make a knife and grind it myself, what kind of steel would I use? What would you say?
I'd say 80 CRV is my steel of choice. And the reason I say that, it's a spring steel. The heat treat is very easy. You know, you don't need any special, you don't have to cryo it. You heat it up in your forge, you quench it in your oil, you temper it in your home oven. It's just very user friendly. And it is a very, very easy to sharpen steel. Maintains a great edge steel. I love that stuff.
Yeah. What was that called again?
80 CRV. Yeah, it's
Cut a
a
knife
spring.
out of an old circular saw blade.
Say that again?
If you have an old circular saw blade and you cut a knife out, what do you have to do after you cut the knife out of that?
Well-
Is that something feasible to use?
You could make a knife out of that. The question is it a good steel that's gonna make a good knife?
I don't know, that's what I'm asking.
You know what, and that's the answer, because who knows what that thing's made of? You know what I mean? What kind of steel is it? And that's the hard part. Hard with great. That'll make a great knife. That'll make a great knife, I'm telling you. So that's what Thaddeus was saying earlier, that the cheapest part of this is the steel. And I did start out with lawnmower blades and files, and like a lot of people have, right? Because it's available, you have it, you don't know if it's gonna be for you or not, right? So I did do that, and I quickly started buying the steel.
Now, if it's an old circular saw blade, is it a real old one with the?
No, this is for a 10-inch, and I was talking about knife, I'd like to make maybe an 8-inch Ulu blade.
Okay.
You know, because most of the stuff that Ulu knives you buy are like 5, 5.5.
Sure.
I'd like to get something a little bit bigger. I don't think I can go and buy an 8-inch Ulu blank.
Down and dirty is check it with a file or grinder.
Yeah, I mean, you can try to harden it. You know, for a simple steel like that, it's either gonna get hardened or it's not. So, one way that I always check if something hardened or
I was
not.
hoping it's hard, stick it in the oven, contemporary, and it'll be fine.
Yeah, check with a file. You know, it should skate a file, after it's hardened.
But you're still gonna have to harden it. You wouldn't be able to just cut it out and temper it and use it. You'd have to cut it out, you'd have to harden it, check it with your file, and then you can draw your temper back out of it.
Thank you.
All right, sorry about this. So back up and running. So I was saying I just use a 3/32 pin. I like using small pins. I usually don't go more than 3/32. A lot of times I'll use 1/16. I'll drill the holes through the top of the larger holes in the tang already, make it easy on myself, through the scales. And then I'll take that carbide scriber I was saying I have, and I will scribe around that. You can see where the outline of the scale is. Also notice that's way too long in front, as you can see, right? It's hanging over where I need. I have plenty of meat out there to work with later, okay? So then what I'll do is I'll take that one side, I'll cut it in half. I'll cut it in half so I can match the other side, and I'll clamp them together. And the liner material can help, so you don't make two right side scales or two left side scales, right? Which we've all done, right? I've done plenty. So face to face or back to back, however you want to do it, you clamp them together. Now we're using the scale itself to drill the hole, not the blank again. Because remember, the blank has a little bit larger holes. If you use the blank again, you're never going to get this thing perfect. So you use the other side of the scale. You drill them through, and then what I'll do, and I made it, this is something I make with old drill bits. When I burn out my 3/32 drill bits, I throw them in a bin, and I will glue them into like these little copper 1/4-inch things, so I don't throw them away, so I know what they are. And I'll use those to hold those two pieces together. So those two scales are on top of each other, and I pin them together with a 3/32, couple 3/32 pins. And that's pretty tight, and they will not come apart, especially on the part. I could then take them over to my bandsaw and cut close to my scribed line. Not right on it, but pretty close, not leaving too much fat. And take your time doing that. Doesn't take long. If you take your time, you'll do it real well. So now we have basically our scales. They're roughly cut to shape, and they have all our holes. Now we're going to order a test, and now we're going to start working on the front. So I'll take a Sharpie and I'll draw on that blade where I want that scale to end up. Okay? That's where I want it to look like. I'll transfer the marks to the side. I do it on the top and the bottom, and then I'll transfer that over to my scales. Now I can take those over to the bench, and I know, I connect those two lines, right? When I connect those two lines, I'll take them over to the bandsaw. I'll cut that off. And now we're going to finish sand that front. So I will take that over to the grinder, or if you didn't have a grinder, you can use maybe a random orbital sander and some hand sandpaper to get that nice and clean and perfect. And since they're pinned together, you're going to have them perfectly symmetrical. Then I will take them and 45 the edges. So you don't have such an abrupt, angle or abrupt end to that front. Because when we sand it later, you'll see how it kind of blends in. But I'll 45 those edges or put some kind of angle on it. And then I will finish sand that. So what I have is I have these hand sanding. I have a whole drawer full of hand sanding tools. This one is a piece of metal, and I have a little piece of rubber on it. I'll take those little pieces of sandpaper, different grits, and I'll take that up to 600 or 800 or something like that. Maybe the last one I'll sand it with like WD-40 or something. And then the front of that is done. I'm never going to touch it again, right? Because it's going to be almost impossible for me to sand that without screwing up my blade. So now the front's done. As you can see, I test fit it back on the knife, and you can see how it fits. That's basically that. Now I'm going to glue my scales to my blade. And I first go back to the surface plate and make sure they're good and flat. So when I glue them up, I don't have any gaps or any issues. And then I will glue those on. In this instance, I use epoxy. Thaddeus was asking me earlier, do I always use epoxy? And it's like half the time. Sometimes I use that other acrylic adhesive that I was talking about. But this time I'm using epoxy. And just a word on epoxy. So I use Smooth On EA40, that bow, the epoxy that they make bows with, only because I have a bunch of it. But it works great. It sands real well. It's a slow curing epoxy. At room temperature, it probably take 24 hours or something to work with. I do not like the 5-minute type epoxies that you get at Walmart or something. And the reason why is they are very gummy. I mean, they may set up in 5 minutes, but they do not sand worth a crap. I mean, they're very gummy. And actually, they're expensive. Even though they're like $3 or $4 for the tubes, when you look at the quantity that you're getting, it's kind of an expensive epoxy. So if you use epoxy, or even if you go to Walmart and get epoxy, get the longer setting stuff. It'll sand better. So it won't be so gummy.
Wait, would you explain why you had the blade on the handle?
Yeah, so on this knife, if you can see, there's a lot of handle there and a little bit of blade. I'm trying to reduce the weight on that knife. So I will take it to my grinder, and my grinder has a 2-inch wheel on top, and I'll hog that material out the middle. You could also drill it out. I could add a bunch of drill holes in there. That'd be a real way to reduce the material, reduce the weight.
And also, if you're using wood or antler, it makes your steel,
Yeah.
glue line disappear on the edge because
That's true. When you hog out the middle, it's easier to flatten the knife, right? You're not flattening the whole thing, you're just flattening the edges. And then it'll keep things flat, and then it also holds epoxy in there. It gives it a look of more meat. Another tip I have is, these Grizzly catalogs. 874 pages of epoxy glue surface. You never have to fit on your work. And so every time I glue anything up, I mix it on there, I rip it off, throw it away. So, okay, so I got a 1-year-old boy at home. And what I've learned over the years is gluing up a knife is a lot like changing a dirty diaper. You gotta get prepared for a mess. So, on the left, you can see I'm laying out my wipes, getting ready here. I'll take one paper towel, and rip it up into strips. And when I glue up that knife, I will take one of those things, because you don't want to have a mess over your fingers, your workbench, and the blade. Take one paper towel and swipe that side and throw it away. I don't fold it over and try to reuse it. Another paper towel, swipe it, throw it away. you know, just to get rid of that stuff, and without getting it on you. You can do that pretty clean. And for some reason, even I know that it takes like 24 hours for that epoxy to settle, it makes me nervous. Like I'm running out of time, but I'm not, you know. So just kind of take your time with it and do a clean process. When I get towards the end, after it's kind of clean, and you can see I'm clamping it up, I will take WD-40 and a toothbrush, and I'll spray the front end of that. Because I'm going to grind, that epoxy's still squeezed out on the sides. And remember, my scales are a little fatter. So I'm going to grind that stuff away. But on the front, remember, we never want to touch that thing again. So we put the WD-40 on there, clean the blade off, and it'll get all the epoxy off. Take your toothbrush and scrub it. And depending on if you have a slow setting epoxy, and especially if you're using like the spring clamps, you got to babysit that a little bit, because if more squeezes out later, you want to get it before it hardens. The other thing I'm going to show you here on the left is I'm using temporary pins. A lot of times, if you watch that Forge and Fire show, they're always gluing up their knives with the pins in them already and grinding everything off. I think this is a much better way. I use temporary pins, so those are 3/32, just pieces of wire, and I've polished them, I've WD-40'd them so that I can pull them out. And I'll put those temporary pins in there. And then it's clamped up. You gotta wait for it to dry. After a few hours or something like that, I'll take those pins out. And if I'm using that acrylic fast setting adhesive, you know, you gotta work pretty quick with getting those out. But they'll come out, and those won't move around. I usually use some spring clamps, definitely in the middle, and on the ends, I'll try to use more of a regular like C-clamp, or those can't twist type clamps. They keep things in place. But here we have it. We have our glued up knife. The front is totally finished, sanded, and done, and all of our holes are still full of epoxy, right? So we got to go back to the drill and drill them out. No big deal. Then we work on our edges. So I'll then go back to my grinder. If you don't have a grinder, you can use hand files and hand sandpaper. Do it by hand, right? It just takes some time. I'll get all the sides of the knife perfectly flush, ground, finished sand. And I really won't touch those again now either. I'm working my way to the sides of the knife. Then I'll go to my grinder. If you didn't have a grinder, you can use files to do this. And I'll 45 or angle, I'm starting to remove some material is what I'm doing. And then, I'll do that, and then I'll go to that grinder and I'll work it a little bit so it starts rounding that edge, just to rough it in. There it's roughed in on the left, and you can still see I have some grind marks in there, so it's not perfect. I do the rest of the work basically by hand. So I have a little knife vise that I made that holds that blade, and a file, and I'll do that work by hand. And you'll get better results doing it by hand than on the grinder. You can screw this stuff up on the grinder so quickly. So I'll try to rough it in on the grinder and finish it by hand. I'm using a file there to get it close. Then I'm going to go back to sandpaper. Here I have my sanding stick with that rubber piece on it, and I'm doing 220 first, and I'm going, actually I'll stop at like 220 or 320 at this step, and that's kind of where it is on the right. At this time I'm checking it. So what I'm really looking for there is the gap, is this thing symmetrical or not? Do I have too much meat between, the top corners? Does it look right? I'm looking at those corners. And then, if they're not, go back to that knife vise with sandpaper and get it perfect, or as close to perfect as I can get it. So it's a visual thing. No measurements, just look at it. You can get really close visually by doing that. Now we're going to put our pins in. So, simple drawing I have. We are going to taper out the top of those holes just a tad. There's two ways you could do it. You could use a tapered reamer and make them like a 2-0 or a 1-0 or a 3-0 depending on your pin size. Or you could use a straight reamer and make it like 5 or 10% more than your drill bit size. So if you're using 3/32, which is like 93 thousandths, you use like 100,000th reamer or something like that. Just a little bit. Something for that, when you hammer that pin down for it to mushroom out into. So here I'm using a taper reamer, and it's not a lot, just a little bit. Then I'm putting in my pins. I'm using nickel silver pins. Nickel silver is real soft. It's really nice material. It's like soft as copper wire. You could use copper wire. You can do it on cheap. You could use wiring from your home, the home wire, 12 gauge or 10 gauge, whatever. It'll peen. It's soft. It'll peen. It'll turn green over time. Nickel silver is pretty nice stuff. I'll put those in there. I'll clip them off. I will clip it and then sand it, or with a file, get a square edge on both sides. Okay? And you can see how much is kind of sticking out. Then I'm going to go over to my trusty old railroad track anvil there, which I have on my bench. And I'm taking a 16-ounce hammer, putting that knife on there, and giving it one good one, and maybe even flip it over on another one. And when you use a 16-ounce hammer on that first peen, it will really mushroom that thing out on the top. And that's just 1 or 2 hits with that. Not super hard, just enough to mushroom it. Then I'm going to go back and I'm going to use my favorite hammer, this little 4-ounce hammer. I'm going to use that little 4-ouncer, and I'll be able to see did I mushroom it all out or not. And I can get it perfect there. When you use a little 4-ounce hammer, it's really just moving the top metal. So you're just moving that top around to fill in that gap that you created with the reamer. At this point, we have a glued on scale. We also have a pin, not only going through it, but mushrooming on both sides. I mean, the handle's not going anywhere, right? And I think that's why it's better than just gluing in your pins from the start. So you're just gluing in a straight pin. Then I'll go back to the knife vise. I'll take my file and I'll hit the top of those heads off to get them nice and flush. And now at this point, we have our knife sanded, we have the front of the knife sanded, we have the edges of the knife sanded. All we're really doing is the sides at this point. Because I have the pins in there, those pins are harder than harder. And they're going to be harder than wood or really any other material you have. I will first use one without a rubber pad on it. And the reason why is if you use one with a rubber pad, it will dig more into that harder than the pin. When you put your finger over it, you're going to feel it. So if you ever feel a knife or something, you can feel the pins, it's because you're kind of wobbling out the material around it and the pin is staying proud. So I'll use a flat, totally flat piece of steel with the sandpaper as the backer, sand that, and I'll sand it down to whatever I sand in the front, 600, 800. I'll then hit the corners a bit, and that's it. Then you're done, So it's a finished knife at that point. I don't have this knife here, but if you would feel those pins and close your eyes, you would not be able to feel it, going up and down, because they're perfectly smooth. And because I use that, I sand them perfectly smooth, and with that flat piece of steel, which is helpful. And that's it. That's attaching scales to a knife. So yeah.
The pins, if I'm following this, the pins are pretty, but they're really not functional, are they?
Oh, in this knife they are. Well, they're functional in all knives. But first of all, if you have a pin in there, it's going to prevent lateral movement, right? Shifting. It's going to prevent shifting. It may not prevent this, but since we peened them, we mushroom both edges, and it's going to prevent them from coming. So now it is structural, definitely structural. All right.
I just wanted, when you're mushrooming that in, be very careful when you're working on canting a bone or wood, because it'll just mushroom it till it fills the void.
Yeah. Yep, made that mistake.
Many times.
My $30 stag scales, yeah, you gotta be soft. That's also why it's helpful to use a soft pin material, because if you're trying to peen stainless steel or something, that's it doesn't move as well. You have to hammer it more. The more times you hammer, the more times you have a chance to slip off or crack that material. That's another reason why micarta is really